A picture is worth 1,000 words. President Donald Trump and his administration have welcomed white Afrikaners while ending Afghan protections. Tyrone Bowman, live. The Trump administration welcomed white South African refugees into the U.S. on Monday, the same day it announced it is ending deportation protections for refugees from Afghanistan. The coinciding moves show a split screen of President Trump's immigration crackdown, accepting one group while revoking protections from the other. Since taking office, Trump has sought to get rid of some U.S. refugee admission policies, which have traditionally been focused on resettling people fleeing violence, war, famine, and genocide. The first flight carrying a group of South Africans granted refugee status arrived in Virginia on Monday. The State Department announced the admission of Afrikaners, a white ethnic minority that dominated South African politics during apartheid, is in response to Trump's, quote, call to prioritize U.S. refugee resettlement of this vulnerable group facing unjust racial discrimination in South Africa, end quote. The department said. The group has said they have been denied jobs and face violence because of their race. More Afrikaner refugees will arrive in the U.S. in the coming months, per the State Department, and ask why there's an expedited path into the country for Afrikaners, but not for others. Trump said Monday, quote, because they're being killed, and we don't want to see people being killed, adding it's a genocide that's taking place, end quote. Farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me, Trump said. Well, how come black refugees can't come under the same sense of urgency? Now, let me read this. Quote, farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me, end quote, Trump said. Apartheid in South Africa for hundreds of years was one of the most vicious, hellish types of living situations for black people who were born in their own country. Segregation, bigotry, racism, murders, rapes, killings. And nobody cared about them. The lone voice was Nelson Mandela, who was thrown in prison on Robbins Island to rot. A South African trained lawyer. People forget about the activist Winnie Mandela, who took up the fight where her husband left off and fought ferociously the entire time Mandela was locked in prison. Mandela became South Africa's first black president, and the only reason why he became president because South Africa was on the verge of civil war. They wanted him to die in prison, but he didn't. Him and the AFC, the African National Congress. So now that Ramaphosa is the president of South Africa, they have a problem with it? But where was the outcry for the hundreds of thousands and the hundreds of thousands of black people who were brutalized and killed during apartheid? And now one person is paid for those murders to this date. I don't make this stuff up. I just report it. So now white South Africans are welcome to America, but nobody else can't come unless they're white. I'm reading President Trump's statement, quote, farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me, end quote, Trump said. But a South African court determined in February that claims of a white genocide in the country are not true. over 9,000 Afghans could face deportation after the Department of Homeland Security announced the revocation of their temporary protected status on Monday. DHS said last month that it would not renew temporary protection status or TPS for Afghanistani refugees, but said Monday that termination is slated for July 12. Permitting Afghans to remain temporarily in the U.S., quote, is contrary to the national interests, end quote, of the country, the department said in a release. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, quote, determined that overall there are notable improvements in the security and economic situation, such that requiring the return of Afghan nationals or Afghanistani does not pose a threat to their personal safety due to ongoing armed conflict or extraordinary and temporary conditions, the department said. History will judge what's going on. Just like during the civil rights movement, the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., people want to downplay it, pretend that it didn't happen. He didn't lay down his life. He was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. History will judge what's going on today. I mean, he's the president. If he wants to bring them here, that's his prerogative. He has the right to do what he chooses to do. Nobody's disputing that. I'm just dealing with how it looks. The Trump administration is reportedly considering exempting Christian Afghans from deportation, as several Christian groups have lobbied for them to remain in the U.S. due to fears of persecution by the Taliban, Politico reported last month. Let me just say something here. Now, I'm going to save that for an editorial. Refugee groups have condemned ending TPS for Afghans, as many who fled the country and were granted the status helped the U.S. military during its 2-decade military presence in the Central Asian nation. Quote, terminating protections for Afghans is a morally indefensible betrayal of allies who stood shoulder to shoulder with us to advance American interests throughout our country's longest war. Krish O'Mara. I can't even pronounce the last name. I don't want to mess it up, so I'll spell it. Vignaragah, President and CEO of Global Refuge, said in a statement last month. And he also pointed out to the dangers waiting for many Afghan women and girls if they return to their home country, quote, where they face systemic oppression and gender-based violence, because they're going to be under Taliban rule and they're going to be under Sharia law. Now think about that. Taliban rule, Sharia law. Sharia law is the strictest law of Orthodox Islam. It would be an utterly unconscionable stain on our nation's reputation, he said. Trump tried to end TPS designations for several countries during his first term. Since taking office for a second time, his administration has moved to end temporary deportation protections for an estimated 300,000 plus Venezuelans living in the United States, as well as for Haitian migrants. TPS is a federal program that allows migrants from certain countries to legally live and work in the U.S. while the conditions in their home country are unsafe. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. Appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed to Tyrone Bowman Live, please consider. On this channel, I cover all topics and all issues. I'm not biased toward any group of people or political persuasion. I cover the Democrats. I'll call them out if they're wrong. It don't matter to me, because I'm an independent registered voter. I vote by conscience. And if the Republicans do great things, I'll talk about that as well. I'm looking for good news to report about Republicans. All right, until next time, thank you for watching. Never surrender, never quit.